We're here tonight to celebrate the release of Dark Laboratory with author Tao Leigh Goffe in conversation with Imani Perry. Imani Perry is the National Book Award-winning author of South to America, as well as 7 other books of nonfiction. She's the Henry A. Moores Jr. and Elizabeth W. Moores Professor of the Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, and of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, and is a 2023 MacArthur Fellow. Tao Leigh Goffe is a London-born Black British award-winning writer, theorist, and interdisciplinary artist who grew up between the UK and New York. Her research explores Black intellectual histories, political and ecological life of the diaspora. She studied English literature at Princeton University before pursuing a PhD at Yale. She lives and works in Manhattan, where she is currently an associate professor at Hunter College. Dr. Goffe also has held academic positions in leadership and fellowships at Leiden University in the Netherlands and also at Princeton. Dark Laboratory on Columbus, the Caribbean, and the Origins of the Climate Crisis is a groundbreaking investigation of the Caribbean as both an ideal of the American imagination and a dark laboratory of Western experimentation, revealing secrets to racial and environmental progress that impact how we live today. In 1492, Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean island of Guanahani to find an Edenic scene that was soon mythologized. But behind the myth of paradise, the Caribbean and its people would come to pay a price of relentless Western exploitation and abuse. In Dark Laboratory, Dr. Goffe embarks on a historical journey to chart the forces that have shaped these islands, the legacy of slavery, indentured labor, and the forced toil of Chinese and enslaved Black people who mined the island's bounty, including guano, which at the time was more valuable than gold, for the benefit of European powers and at the expense of the island's sacred ecologies. Braiding together family history, cultural reportage, and social studies, Goffe radically transforms how we conceive Blackness, the natural world, colonialism, and the climate crisis. And in doing so, she deftly dismantles the many layers of entrenched imperialist thinking that shroud our established understanding of the human and environmental conditions to reveal the cause and effect of a global catastrophe. Dark Laboratory forces a reckoning with the received forms of knowledge that have led us astray. And here to tell us more are Imani Perry and Tao Leigh Goffe.
Good evening. I am so delighted to be in conversation with you. And I just have to say for a moment, so I met Tao at Princeton when she was just a baby. And I have witnessed your blooming as an intellectual, as a scholar, as an artist, and in the most extraordinary ways. This book is an extraordinary achievement. And I want to begin at the beginning, in a sense, and ask you, so we have 1492, and there's a mythology that comes with that date. When I was in school, people were still saying 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? And a mythology that has cut in multiple ways, one of which is a kind of patriotism, right? That this is the inception point for what will become the US empire. I want you to sort of tell folks how you orient the reader differently to that event that shapes so much of the crises that we're living with today.
Yeah, thank you, Imani. It's just incredible to be sitting here with you because I remember when I first came to your office at Princeton so long ago, and at that time I was writing about British Islamic hip hop, so Prophets of the Hood was just really incredible as a kind of guide, as a kind of map, and I know that it still stands in the genre in that way, and I feel like I tried to create a map in this book. and it gives us a new timeline. So 1492 becomes a point of rupture. And I spoke today with Dr. Maggie Gates, who's here on her podcast, about this reperiodization of the climate crisis, about the ways in which folks tend to think about the Industrial Revolution. They probably picture smokestacks, as we have depicted on the book cover, as the origin of the crisis. But I wanted to rewind and to think in a non-linear temporal way about the plantation and to think about deforestation. So it was really great to be able to work with the book designer to depict this crisis of monocrop agriculture and to really sit with the fact that when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, he brought with him sugarcane in 1493 to Hispaniola. And that, of course, is bittersweet for so many people, not least of all our ancestors who were brought to this hemisphere forcibly, but also to the indigenous peoples of the Americas who, for thousands of years, had other forms of cultivation, agrarian traditions. So I wanted to really give us a new way to think about the question of the origins and to think about possible redemption and solutions and the ways in which we haven't even agreed upon what the origins of the crisis are. But we certainly know that monocrop agriculture leads to the depletion of the soil. So this violence against the soil is entangled, of course, with violence against peoples. And I wanted to look at these Black histories, Asian histories, Indigenous histories, and the ways in which people have been made disposable and have even been treated as fertilizer for American white progress.
Yeah, and you, well, let me ask, because so much of what you just said, I think maybe is threaded through this question. What comes into view differently when you center the Caribbean in modernity versus the sort of sites of imperial formation or even the kind of new empire of the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I feel that a reorientation, a disruption of Columbus Day comes into view. And it really begins with Guanahani, as Silas just mentioned, which is the present day Bahamas, which is where Columbus landed. And I love that in your new book, Black and Blues, you also touch on the Caribbean as part of this wayfinding through the color blue. So yeah, I feel that the Caribbean is treated as America's backyard due to the Monroe Doctrine. However, what does it mean that Plymouth Rock could be juxtaposed with the island paradises of the Caribbean?
Yeah.
And this kind of erasure? And I guess in American studies, what we call this myth of the Virgin Land really comes into play and continues to be part of how tourism rescripts the Caribbean as Eden, but doesn't figure again in this timeline from 1492.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, for me, that is part of what you do is, what I think is so brilliant is that, there's a piece that's about sort of national mythologies and origins and disrupting those, but there's something that happens also with disrupting those myths, right? But there's something that happens when you actually look to the persistence of certain kinds of fantastical representations that lie above a much more complex truth, right? So that it's almost as though for me, it's sort of like that what you can see today in terms of how the Caribbean is constructed is also, like you're telling us, okay, this history tells us how we got to the climate crisis, but you're also telling us this present helps us understand how the past was so mischaracterized. There's something about what you can see today. And one of the things that I would love for you to talk about is, that I think is really interesting, is Afro-Asia, and in particular, how centering the Caribbean actually makes the concept of Asian American a much more complex category, right? I mean, than what we talk about in the United States.
Yeah, I would love to answer that question because I'm always, for my students, distinguishing between Afro-Asia and Afro-Asian. So thinking about the kind of political stakes of decentering the West, decolonization movements, especially thinking of India's liberation, but also and especially Bandung in 1955, the Asian African Conference. And then you have Afro-Asian, which is a different, I guess, signifier, and maybe more so speaks to my heritage, which I explore in the book.
Can you talk about it?
Yeah, in terms of being Jamaican Chinese, and the fact that, yeah, when I was in graduate school, people said, oh, that's so niche, you can't write about the Jamaican Chinese. But I'm like, literally, Africa and Asia are the global majority, right. And they come together in an island like Jamaica in ways that are deeply about labor histories that are also obviously climate histories. It's about Black emancipation, it's about the labor vacuum in the 19th century, wherein the British decided to replace African labor with Asian labor. And the fact that we don't learn about this, I think, is just systemic of the kind of forgetting and the kind of epistemic violence that just erases people and renders them invisible, and also pits people against one another. So Black and Asian people against one another. And of course there are tensions in this history, but I feel like if we actually understand it in terms of coalition, there's a lot of hope in the guano wars. So to think about the 19th century and the fact that Chinese laborers were forced to extract guano, which is seabird droppings on the Chincha Islands in Peru, but this was also taking place in Haiti, so in the Caribbean, where African Americans from Maryland were also being forced to do this backbreaking labor. And then we look to the Pacific and Hawaii, and Polynesian laborers were also being forced to do this labor. And reliably, where people are being exploited, they rise up. And this book really was for me about tuning into those rebellious echoes of these laborers who took the pickaxes and shovels and rose up against their white overseers. And the conditions were carcinogenic, the kind of ammonia that was part of the atmosphere, it's horrifying, but there's such a kind of sense of uprising, a kind of labor history that's also a climate history that I was excited to be able to tell from this frame of Afro-Asia. So from a frame of looking at the global majority and a sense of uprising, but also to sit with why it is that we never learn about this in school.
Okay, I mean, why, I mean, it's a complicated question to answer, but I mean, I am curious about, because I was gonna ask why don't we learn about it, because part of what you are arguing for in telling the story is also a kind of ethics about the present moment, like a ethic about how we actually save ourselves from climate catastrophe, if possible, right?
Yeah, and I think that ethics comes from storytelling and the importance of it, and thinking about who the protagonists or the characters are in the climate crisis. Maggie and I talked about that today, and I think that Sylvia Wynter is an incredible guide in the kind of grammar that she gives us and asks us to question who is the we and the us. So when we talk about the climate crisis and who is to blame, and let's say terms like the Anthropocene, which I reject, I feel that the blame is uneven because there are all of these asymmetries. So if we actually can sit with storytelling, which is a matter that we look at in the actual lab, the dark laboratory, we're actually able to sit with the crossroads of stolen land and stolen life and come to terms with the overlap there. And I think that if we were to understand this crisis through different witnesses, that I identify like coral reefs and mongooses and even volcanoes, then we understand a sense of geologic time that I've called Black geologic time, through which more is possible, such as what it has meant to live beyond world-ending events.
So, you referenced the Dark Laboratory. Do you want to talk a little bit more about
Sure.
your network? Yeah, well,
So yeah, the Dark Laboratory is a place. It's a book. At darklaboratory.com, you can read more about the genesis of it. We're on the 16th floor of Hunter College, which is at 68th and Lexington. So you can come and say hi if you're on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. I'm currently on maternity leave. So I'll be back in the fall, but we're really open to different community-led and engaged initiatives. Again, centering storytelling, so through filmmaking, podcasting, we experiment with virtual reality, and it's complementary to the classes that I'm teaching at Hunter College. But we have 30 different members that are dubbed as theoreticians across the globe, so in places like Finland and Hawaii, and we're all asking this question about what indigenous means. And yeah, the book was originally called After Eden, but somebody scooped us with the title, and the publishers thought, well, why don't you just name it for your practice, for your lab? And I think it was a great idea because it allows me to linger with these metaphors of the dark and to really honor Toni Morrison, who I know is so important to your work. So it's really an ode to her 1992-93 book, Playing in the Dark.
yeah, the riches. So I snuck out of school. I skipped school to go to those lectures.
Oh my gosh.
That were, but I mean, I think right, they're powerful for so many reasons, but one of them is is that they do the thing that you do so masterfully as well, which is let's return to the sites, to the texts that are understood in a sort of, in a very particular kind of way, and reread, and open things up as a process, as part of the process of rereading. But I wanted you to talk about sort of the spatial of the Dark Laboratory and the practice, because you also have this way of moving in the world as an intellectual, as an artist, as an organizer. So that is distinct, and in some ways, I think there's something that's like kind of groundbreaking. And what I mean is that it's not just that you're doing different things, but they actually are the same thing, right?
Yeah,
in different forms,
right?
right? Which is, which I think there are people who do different, but to do the same thing and to find different landscapes for doing, some of which is also sonic or musical.
Yeah, I mean, I feel it comes from Black studies and the kind of versatility of the code switching of Black life, but certainly of the academic discipline and what it requires in terms of a rigor across so many different fields, and maybe asking the same question but finding different methods or ways to answer that question.
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe Eddie Glaude had said this at Princeton in terms of the different disciplines and methods of asking the same question, which might be about Black liberation. And I just feel like whether I'm doing it through visual art or DJing or writing a book or curating an exhibition, the question is a vexing one, and I'm still looking for the answer to it. And I'm okay with not knowing the answer. So that's been a major theme on the book tour, is asking questions that we don't know the answer to.
Yeah.
And I'd say the climate crisis certainly is one of those questions, and there's a understandable sense of doom, but I also feel that there's a lot of radical hope when we can apply all of these different methods and actually come together interdisciplinarily. And I think that Black studies has done that for generations. So I just feel like a humble inheritor of that tradition. And so much of it is necessarily sonic. When we think about Mary Baraka and blues people, and now that transcends national boundaries, because it is about this question of sovereignty.
Yeah, yeah. There's that point about Black studies is so well taken, and for me, it feels like this essential point that we have to keep repeating, because it's so often characterized as something that is niche or small or very particular, when in fact it allows for a kind of rigor that is unparalleled, right?
Yeah.
Because it's sonic, it's political, it's environmental, it's spiritual. Like, there's all of these points of entry, and they actually do have to be understood. You actually have to attend to multiple disciplines to even apprehend a place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yet people always ask us about methodology, and there is a tradition.
Yeah.
There are people who've been working in this tradition forever.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that we define theory and theorists is also exciting in terms of how I think other disciplines can learn from us and perhaps are surprised. But yeah, I think we're very inclusive and welcoming as far as what that rigor and methodology could look like.
So you mentioned Sylvia Wynter. I want to ask you about two influences. Okay, so one, I want to ask you, for folks who don't know Sylvia Wynter, you talk about who she is and why she's so significant for a project like this, but also just as an intellectual role model.
Sure. So she's a Jamaican philosopher, and yeah, I feel she did everything. She does everything. I think at one point in her career, she was an actress, she wrote plays, and she's really at the heart of this, I guess, keyword of indigenization. So investigating the question of Blackness in the quote-unquote New World, but let's say the Americas, and really, interrogating the grounds of what it means to not be native to here, but to be in relation in ways that engages with indigeneity. So her work on provision grounds is kind of finding a resurgence in terms of literary theory, in terms of the plot and plotting. And it's just incredible to be able to sit with her words in this book and to think about her writing on epistemology and bats. So I have a lot of non-human ecologies and storytellers in the book. And I felt like the ways in which she asks us to think about Blackness and bats really kind of explains my approach, which is also a sonic approach of echolocation. So I just kind of think about her growing up in Jamaica, being born in Cuba, and just her radical sense of asking these questions in and out of institutions. She used to teach at Stanford University, but there's so many incredible women like her who are part of this radical tradition. So it's just great to be able to engage with her work and think about how many living legends there are who are still here and should be receiving their due.
Okay, so the second influence I want to ask you about is more on the sonic side. But actually, will you talk about the record shops in Jamaica a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, crate digging comes into play with this question of provision grounds. Most definitely in my art practice. So I last year had an exhibition, my first solo one, at Wave Hill in the Bronx. And in it, I kind of had this tribute to Sylvia Wynter and her unfinished manuscript, Black Metamorphosis, alongside many different records. So crate digging, I guess, is how DJs describe and music lovers describe kind of like sorting through records to select different songs and albums to play, to mix, to DJ with, but also to buy when you're at a record shop. And it's archival work, for sure.
Yeah.
Obviously, yeah.
And you also talk about this, the sociality aspect of it in terms of the landscape in Jamaica of Chinese-owned shops is.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that part too? Because I love the way you trace the sort of genealogy in it.
Thank you. Yeah, because I feel that it comes back to the Afro-Asian question. So my second book, which will be with Duke University Press, who you're also on that label, as it were. So that book will be called Black Capital Chinese Debt, and it's gonna be a deeper dive into these economies of reggae music and the Chinese influence in terms of capital, and just the function of what are called Chinese shops in Jamaica. So just like we have CVS or corner stores or bodegas, they have general stores in Jamaica that are chiefly run by people of Chinese descent. And I basically traced the ways in which those stores had radios because they had the money to have this technology, and it really influenced making these social spaces where Afro-Jamaican people were remixing and creating the genre of reggae, which is just really incredible to think about its genesis and the fact that they actually were tuning into the US South. So to radio stations from New Orleans to Tennessee. So they were listening to these Chinese radios in Jamaica and then creating their own sound based on jazz, based on R&B, and yeah, there's a little bit of that in here, but the next book will definitely be all about these records and albums and the texture of that sound and the kind of creative friction, because obviously there were tensions in terms of who's profiting from Black art, but it's part of my inheritance. It's part of why I DJ. And people often don't realize that someone like Sean Paul is of Jamaican Chinese heritage. And I think it says a lot when you think about his role in the music industry for the past 20 years.
I mean, well, you know, I'm gonna let you guys ask questions. This may be the last one. But I was thinking, because for me, and I mostly finished a tour a little while ago, and I know this is the sort of, you're in the tail end, at least of this wave of this tour. And one of the things that is always interesting to me is that as I'm talking about a book and having conversations and questions being asked, that something different comes into, oftentimes, not just one thing, multiple things that are different come into view. That is to say that the heart, the sort of the beating heart of the book in some ways gets clarified, or you realize something that you didn't previously know about the book is really important. And I'm wondering if you had if your relationship to this story that you're telling has shifted through this process. Yes or no, and I guess, I mean, I was gonna also ask about what's next, and if the process of being on tour has had an impact on what feels like is next, besides the things that you have planned already, because you know, Tao's working on multiple books at the same time, but if there's something new that's come to the fore.
I love this question because, I think it speaks to how the tour is a verb, and the kind of repetition. I guess I feel like Susan Laurie Parks says it best when she talks about rep and rev as this aesthetic of jazz, obviously, but I think of Blackness more broadly. And there's something about the tour that is like this repetition, but a revision and like a remix each time, which is what makes it so beautiful, because it builds and it builds. It's so great to see people who were at other stops of the tour being here. That means so much. And I guess selfishly, it's been kind of like a party for me and for my baby, who's allowing us to do all of this. Because I have the dragon book, so it was the year of the dragon in the lunar calendar last year, and the dragon baby, who was born 6 months ago. It's just been a kind of clarifying moment to sit with the arguments that I make about nomadic life and what it means to move as a philosophy and a strategy, and how that may be one of the few actual threats to capitalism. So the nomad. And that leads me to what I've written in the book about Chinese indigeneity, being of Hakka Chinese descent. Hakka means guest dweller. So we've always lived in relation to the indigenous Cantonese in a way that has been about a kind of defensiveness, but also sense of scarcity with regard to the land. So making plenty from what seems like it's nothing. And I think that relates a lot to the conditions that Black people have been put in. So I just feel that in the tour, it's been actually energizing to keep moving, especially in this fraught political climate. Maybe there's something that's really satisfying about being on the move. So I'm grateful for the invitations, but also I kind of just like the feeling of going and going, repeating and revising, and yeah, just letting the book take us to new places. So I'm just really grateful to you for your friendship and mentorship, and for your book, which also feels like such a map.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing. The remapping is, I feel like, is at the heart of what is necessary. Yeah.
Yeah, I think with time and with space. So I feel like you also talk about Yoruba temporalities, like there's just so many other traditions that we could be drawing on, and they could be liberating if we allowed them, instead of this Western colonial notion of time, which, as we know, was really invented recently and largely out of ordering the plantation.
Yeah, yeah. Are there questions? Oh, wait, look, yes.
Hopefully I can project enough. Am I projecting? Okay. First of all, thank you both. I'm super excited that I got to hear this conversation. My question is mostly about the sense that you're thinking about the role of like man or like man-made roles in this kind of climate crisis. I'm wondering how this project has shaped your thinking about a term like complicity, or like how this is like changing what you're thinking about the sense that perhaps there's like a hierarchy in terms of role or influence, but also the sense that that complicity is like showing up in all these layers of like how the project is right.
Wow, I love that question, because I feel like it was very succinct, but had all these layers of theory in it. Because of your attention to grammar. And I would say, yeah, we know that the climate crisis was man-made. Maggie and I were talking about that today. And yet, yeah, the role of the human, if we're looking at Winter's work, this idea of the genre of man, is really something that is not agreed upon by everyone. And I was talking about how, speaking to scientists like oceanographers, people in business schools, they've been really shocked most of all in terms of the book, in that I'm talking about humans. So that's been eye-opening for me, that a lot of people see this crisis in terms of data, and they don't think that data relates to humans. And to that, I respond with, where did business schools begin? What is this science of optimization, financial engineering? And it comes from the plantation, from the violent accounting of the plantation. The field of statistics, if they want to talk about data, also comes from eugenics. So I feel like the question of man, yeah, it's so loaded and layered that if we were truly to attend to it across disciplines, I think we might actually get somewhere. So it's been stunning to realize that so many fields are just not even attending to human life, let alone what it would mean for it to survive this.
Other questions?
Great, congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, good. So Sylvia Winter, I forget if it's an interview or an essay, but she expresses this desire to have her writing and her theory hit like an Aretha Franklin song. So I
Wow.
wonder if there's a way, or if there's a song or an artist who you want your prose to hit like.
To propose to what?
To hit like. So
Oh.
you want hers to hit like Aretha, and you want yours to hit like.
I love that, and thank you for bringing it to the conversation, because I would love to read that essay and I haven't. But I feel like there's a kind of sense of liner notes in the book, and we've been doing sound clashes on different book tour events, and obviously that's a huge part of Jamaican culture, Caribbean culture, Black culture generally. So I begin with the epigraph. Some of those that work forces are the same that burn crosses. And that's from Rage Against the Machine. So I would love if the book hits because that song, like, I've screamed that song from 1992, Killing in the Name. And it has been kind of like a middle finger to the Academy to, the question of evaluation, the question of being legible. I've been told that I'm illegible, and I like that.
Me too.
So-
Over and over and over again.
So I think that, it's great to hear that it would be Aretha for her. But this song, 1992, is important because it was about Rodney King. And we know who the Klansmen are. So to talk about burning crosses, I think resonates in a moment like this, for sure. So, that song runs throughout the book, as well as many other songs.
Was there a particularly exciting research moment for you that made you feel like you had to catch the prose in buckets?
I guess all of it, especially where I was encountering different guides along the way, because I felt like these people, indigenous and Black bird watchers, they were theorizing. I talk about an encounter with a maroon chief. So there's just, I guess, sprinklings of different moments that felt really profound to me about this question of Black geological time, about indigenous ways of understanding nature. One of them is on page 70. Let's see if I can find it. But there was a tour guide in Tahiti, and I've often thought about what it means to kind of be forced to become a tour guide of your own culture and what it means to resist that. And this tour guide, he was wonderful, but it was just interesting that he did not want to know our names, and he told us that. And it was mainly American people on the tour, and he said what would tell him more about us is to answer two questions. One is, what is the river you were born closest to? And two is, which river do you drink your water from every day? So, I feel like that was definitely a moment that I would want to catch in buckets, as it were, about water and the fact that I didn't know the answer to where I drink my water from every day. But walking around here today and seeing the Charles River, it was just profound again, just these little moments of sitting with alternative orientations to nature, to time, to possession. So that was a really special moment.
Thank you so much for being here. This was so lovely. And a question I have, I'm a student of kind of STS and history of science, and so I think we think of the laboratory, and I'm taught the laboratory, right? It's a very specific space that emerged at a very specific period with a very specific set of conditions, right? And this importance of the laboratory to Western science. So I was thinking about and wondering in your book how you are reworking, re-envisioning, and defining, what a laboratory means, what it means to experiment, both in the book and in your practice, and kind of what, in the discovery and your research of the book, have you come to understand what the meaning of a laboratory is, for Black studies or for your own orientation?
Thank you for the question, and it's great to know it's coming from STS. I got very lost on campus today, and it was a fun experience, and I happened to end up in an STS room and building, and it did have me thinking about the history of science. It had me thinking about why a laboratory. I published an article maybe 2 years ago called Not Another Lab, which really asked the question about Frantz Fanon and like, would he have a radical digital humanities lab today? It's about Martinique, like would it be in Martinique, and therefore would the funding come from the French government because Martinique is not sovereign? So in the essay, I really asked questions about funding. We're seeing a lot of that funding being cut right now, and I think it's because the work that we do does pose a threat to certain systems. So for me, the emphasis, I joke that I'm a recovering English major, is on the kind of etymology and really to emphasize the labor in laboratory. And I think in science labs, they're not always thinking about that, but I've also just been inspired by the teamwork that takes place, because in the humanities, most things are single author. There's the idea of like the lone genius writing alone and just getting the credit for all of that. And I wanted to think about what it would mean to co-author. One of our articles that's peer-reviewed has 32 co-authors, and I learned a lot in the 2 years of getting that publication together about these hierarchies, what it means to be the lead author and not, the kind of exploitation that does happen in scientific labs. But most of all, I guess I would say that I think we should have more labs if they are a kind of dare to fund the humanities as much as the sciences are funded. But all of that is obviously in crisis right now. So yeah, I feel the kind of hermetically sealed nature of the lab was something that I was really imagining alongside islands and how they're imagined as labs, and how the Caribbean has been this laboratory, especially for the United States, but obviously for many European nations. So I wanted to sit with what it means to be a test subject of that lab and what it means to survive beyond the lab.
Question. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for this discussion. So speaking of being an English major, I was wondering about the writing of the book and if you found it to be different from writing other academic articles, because obviously you've published in traditional academic journals and you're writing a book for an academic press. And so was it different to write a book for a trade press? Did you find yourself having to shift different styles or whatever to reach a broader audience? So yeah.
Yeah, and just on cue, here's one of the co-authors who was part of this really incredible summer institute where we were mapping racial cartographies. Yeah, I feel the question of writing for trade is so different than the kind of jargon that gets performed often in academic disciplines. So it's been really liberating. It's been a chance to spread my wings. And to answer your other question about next projects, motherhood has been such a transformation that I think the next project will certainly be about sitting with that, thinking about labor, thinking about this refrain that keeps coming up that the most anti-capitalist thing I ever did was give birth. And how surprised that I actually am by that, even though I am a scholar of race and gender. But I would say in terms of trade writing, my editor was incredible, and he kept encouraging me to ask an emotional question. And that's not something that I think we would ever be told to do in academic writing.
But you've also written, beautiful like family essays. So it wasn't you've written from emotional places before.
That's
right?
true. Against the
grain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think we all have emotional questions to ask, and especially about the climate crisis. So I chose to do it through family history because that's where I began my career with family photography and these narratives. But I think that you can answer that emotional question in many different ways, and it doesn't have to necessarily be about your own family. but it's about the risk of those stakes and really asking that unanswered question. I feel like presses like Duke are really moving in that direction with different series that are embracing memoir and more autobiographical ways of writing. So in some ways, I do feel like this is a climate odyssey. It's a climate autobiography, and I really encourage everyone to write their own. So I often in workshops will ask people to bring their oldest family photograph and to just imagine the landscapes that their four grandparents were surrounded by and were protected by, and to ask like which landscapes we feel bound to protect.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, I also come from Hunter alumni, so it's
Awesome.
lovely to hear that you have a lot of work that you do there. So I'm thinking, as also a Caribbean Dominican, also the relationship between Jamaica and the rest of the Caribbean, especially Spanish-speaking Caribbean. I know, for example, reading a book that Jamaica, a lot of Jamaican people were used to work in sugar plantations in DR at one point when there was a invasion from the U.S. there. There were actually two, I think, or one of them. And there was a lot of issues there from the Dominicans at that time being upset because they were using Jamaicans at that point to, of course, pay them less, and all of those issues that happens that create problems with other countries, or anything historical that you know in terms of the connection between the Caribbean and Jamaica.
Yeah, thank you for that question, because speaking of legibility, I feel that there's often the question of how legible the Caribbean is in the US. I just came from the British part of the tour. The Caribbean is very legible in England because they're the direct colonizers. But also they say and they joke that the Caribbean equals Jamaica in England. So I feel like it's been interesting to explore that dynamic, because Jamaica does kind of function as the big brother in terms of its economy. I've heard people describe it as like the New York City of the Caribbean. And it's interesting thinking linguistically about the kind of fragmentation and division, but similar challenges being faced. So I hear a lot from Dominican scholars like Sally Garcia and Sandy Placido, who are doing really incredible work about mining and extraction in the Dominican Republic. So it's not a mistake that the plot is the same. The colonial design of literally extracting from the core of the island. So there's a lot of, I think, fantastic work being done in Black and Indigenous geologies to investigate what is happening in these different mountain villages. So this book is a lot about mountains, and I think that really stretches across the Caribbean. And I'm excited that the book is bringing us to Jamaica. So to Calabash, the literary festival that they have in St. Elizabeth, because my grandfather, who I write about in the book, was born there. But I certainly welcome going to other parts of the Caribbean. I talk about the Dutch Caribbean in the book as well. And there's just such a range of archives that we should be exploring. So it's great to hear that you're looking at this inter-island way of understanding this history, because so often I think it's a kind of nationalist frame that prevents us from really asking the core questions.
Well, thank you so much. You all, if you don't have the book already, buy the book. It is extraordinary, and it's just really a joy to have had this time with you. And give a Tao a round of applause.